The child decides first. Adults only understand later. That was what the elderly housekeeper whispered to me the morning I arrived at Romano Estate. At the time, I thought she was simply being kind. I had no idea those words would change my life. The estate sat on a hill overlooking the ocean, nearly 20 miles outside Boston. Iron gates taller than any building I had ever lived in guarded the entrance. The driveway curved through perfectly trimmed gardens before ending at a mansion that looked more like a luxury hotel than a family home. Everything about the place felt intimidating. The marble floors, the towering windows, the staff moving quietly through endless hallways. I almost turned around before walking through the front doors. It was not my first job interview. It was my 23rd. The previous 22 had ended exactly the same way. Polite smiles. Awkward silence. Rejection. Some employers never bothered hiding the reason. They looked at my size first and my resume second. Others assumed I could not keep up with demanding work. Eventually I stopped arguing. People see what they want to see. At 32 years old, I had learned that lesson well. The estate manager led me through the mansion while explaining my responsibilities. Most of her attention focused on one person. Oliver Romano. 2 years old. Son of Ethan Romano. The manager lowered her voice as we walked. We have had difficulties. Difficulties? She sighed. 7 nannies in 11 months. None lasted. I blinked. 7? She nodded. He refuses everyone. Cries constantly. Will not cooperate. Will not sleep properly. Will not stay with caregivers. Something about her expression suggested the situation was even worse than she described. We stopped outside a large playroom at the end of a quiet hallway. Sunlight streamed through enormous windows overlooking the ocean. Toys covered the floor. Tiny shoes sat beside a rocking chair. The room should have felt cheerful. Instead, it felt lonely. Then I heard a small voice. The little boy sat near the far corner surrounded by stuffed animals. Golden hair. Serious blue eyes. Tiny fingers gripping a toy truck. He looked up the moment we entered. The manager smiled carefully. Oliver, this is Grace. No response. Oliver simply stared at me. The manager attempted another introduction. Still nothing. I recognized the look immediately. Caution. Observation. The same look I had worn most of my life. Children often notice things adults missed. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then the manager quietly excused herself, leaving me alone in the room. The silence felt enormous. I could have approached him immediately. Every training guide recommended that. Instead, I sat on the floor near the doorway. Not close enough to pressure him. Not far enough to ignore him. The ocean shimmered beyond the windows. A clock ticked softly somewhere in the room. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Oliver never looked away. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out a peanut butter sandwich I had packed for lunch. My stomach growled loudly enough to embarrass me. To my surprise, a tiny smile flickered across Oliver's face. Barely visible. Gone almost instantly. But it was there. The first crack in the wall. I smiled back without saying a word. For the next few minutes, we simply sat there. One lonely woman. One lonely child. Sunlight filled the room around us. Then something happened that nobody expected. Oliver stood up, clutching his toy truck, and took a single step toward me. Everyone thought the hardest part would be getting hired. Nobody realized the real story began the moment that little boy started walking in my direction. Oliver took another step. Then another. The toy truck remained clutched in his tiny hand as he crossed the room with slow determination. I stayed exactly where I was. No sudden movements. No cheerful voice. No attempt to persuade him. Children could sense desperation faster than adults realized. Especially children who had learned not to trust easily. The distance between us disappeared one careful step at a time. When he finally stopped, he stood barely 3 feet away. His serious blue eyes studied my face as though he was trying to solve a puzzle. I smiled softly. Hello, Oliver. The little boy said nothing. Instead, he held out the toy truck. The gesture was so unexpected that I almost missed. Are you sharing? I asked quietly. Still no words. Just the truck. I accepted it carefully. Thank you. For the first time, the The tiny smile returned. This time it stayed. Later, the estate manager nearly dropped her clipboard when she walked back into the room. Oliver was sitting beside me on the floor. We were rolling the toy truck across a rug decorated with roads and tiny buildings. The manager stared as though she had witnessed a miracle. He never does that. Oliver looked up immediately. The smile vanished. His shoulders tightened. The manager froze. Then she looked at me. What did you do? I glanced at the little boy. Nothing. We just sat together. Her expression suggested she did not believe me. The truth sounded too simple. Throughout the afternoon, Oliver remained close. Not attached. Not dependent. Just nearby. If I moved to a different part of the playroom, he eventually followed. If I sat near the window, he settled beside me. If I looked through a book, he quietly turned the pages. By dinner time, word had somehow spread through the mansion. Staff members kept finding excuses to pass by the nursery wing. A gardener appeared outside the windows twice.
A chef d'élevé snack nobody requested.
Even the elderly housekeeper stopped by. Everyone wanted to see the impossible child who was suddenly calm. Around 7 o'clock, another presence entered the hallway. I noticed the change immediately. Conversation stopped. Footsteps became quieter. Employees straightened their posture. The atmosphere shifted without anyone saying a word. Ethan Romano had arrived home. I recognized him instantly from photographs. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark suit, calm expression. The kind of man who seemed to carry authority naturally. He paused outside the playroom door. Through the opening, I watched his gaze move toward his son. Oliver was building a tower from wooden blocks beside me. Ethan remained perfectly still. The room felt silent. Then something happened that surprised everyone. Oliver looked up and noticed his father. His face brightened immediately. Daddy. It was the first word I had heard him speak all day. Ethan entered the room. A faint smile appeared on his face. It transformed him completely. He crouched beside Oliver and examined the tower. That is impressive. Oliver nodded proudly. Then he did something else. Something nobody expected. The little boy pointed directly at me. Grace. Ethan's attention shifted toward me for the first time. His eyes were sharp, observant, yet not unkind. Grace? He repeated. Oliver nodded enthusiastically. For several seconds, father and son exchanged a look that seemed to carry an entire conversation. Ethan finally stood. Thank you for today, Miss Walker. His voice was calm and controlled. I smiled politely. We mostly played with trucks. Ethan glanced at Oliver. Judging by the results, that was more successful than anything we have tried in months. As evening settled over the estate and the ocean darkened beyond the windows, I thought the day had already been extraordinary. I was wrong, because the first smile had only been the beginning. The next morning, the mansion woke up expecting the previous day to have been a coincidence. Children were unpredictable. Everyone knew that. One good afternoon did not mean anything had truly changed. At least that was what the staff kept telling themselves. By breakfast, most of them were waiting for Oliver to return to his usual habits. Refusing help. Refusing company. Refusing everyone. I honestly expected the same thing. Instead, the moment I stepped into the dining room, Oliver's face lit up. Grace. My name left his mouth so naturally that several employees nearly froze in place. The little boy immediately climbed down from his chair and hurried toward me. Tiny footsteps echoed across the polished floor. Before I could react, he wrapped his arms around my leg. Good morning to you too, I said softly. The estate manager stared over her coffee cup. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed to know what to say. Throughout the day, Oliver stayed close. We spent the morning building towers from blocks. Then we read picture books beside the nursery window overlooking the ocean. By lunchtime, the atmosphere inside the mansion had changed completely. Staff members who had once looked skeptical now looked curious. A few even smiled when they passed us in the hallways. The elderly housekeeper found me organizing toys after lunch. She watched Oliver playing nearby. Then she shook her head. I have worked here 9 years. I have never seen this. Seen what? I asked. She glanced toward the little boy. Peace. The word stayed with me. Because she was right. Oliver looked peaceful, safe, comfortable. The difference was impossible to miss. Late that afternoon, Ethan returned home earlier than usual. I noticed him standing quietly outside the playroom door. He thought nobody could see him. He was wrong. From where I sat on the floor, I could see his reflection in the glass. He watched his son for several minutes. No phone. No meetings. No distractions. Just a father observing something he had almost stopped hoping for. Oliver was drawing with crayons beside me. He suddenly looked up. "Daddy." Ethan stepped into the room. His gaze moved from Oliver to the drawing spread across the rug. "What are you making?" Oliver proudly held up the paper. The picture consisted mostly of colorful circles and crooked lines. Yet 3 figures were visible. One tall, one small, one round. Ethan crouched beside him. "Is this you?" Oliver nodded. "And me?" Another nod. Ethan pointed toward the 3rd figure. "Who is that?" The answer came instantly. "Grace." Silence filled the room. I felt my cheeks warm. Ethan looked at the drawing again. Something softened in his expression. Before either of us could say anything else, Oliver suddenly stood. He toddled across the rug carrying the paper. Then, in front of his father, the staff passing through the hallway, and several employees lingering nearby, he stopped directly in front of me. For 1 second, the little boy simply smiled. Then he leaned forward and pressed a quick kiss against my cheek. The room went completely silent. I blinked in surprise. So did everyone else. Oliver giggled proudly as though he had accomplished something important. Maybe he had. Because judging by the stunned faces around us, nobody had ever seen him offer affection that freely before. Not to a nanny. Not to a caregiver. Not to anyone outside his immediate family. My eyes lifted toward Ethan. He was still watching. Not shocked anymore. Not suspicious. Just thoughtful. Deeply thoughtful. And standing there with a crayon drawing in one hand and a smiling toddler beside me, I had the strange feeling that something far bigger than trust had just begun. After the kiss, the entire mansion seemed to develop a new habit. Everyone started watching. Not openly. Not rudely. Just enough to notice what happened whenever Oliver and I were together. The little boy who had once rejected every caregiver now searched for me the moment he woke up each morning. If I entered a room, his attention followed. If I left, he noticed. The transformation was so dramatic that even I struggled to understand it. Yet nobody seemed more curious than Ethan Romano. He never asked unnecessary questions. He never interfered. Instead, he observed. Quietly. Carefully. Like a man trying to solve a mystery. One afternoon, I was helping Oliver build a castle from wooden blocks in the playroom. Rain tapped softly against the large windows overlooking the ocean. The room glowed with warm light despite the gray sky outside. Oliver sat cross-legged on the rug beside me, completely focused on stacking blocks higher and higher. Then the tower collapsed. The pieces scattered across the floor. I expected frustration. Instead, Oliver laughed. A full laugh. Bright and genuine. The sound filled the room. I laughed too. Neither of us noticed Ethan standing in the doorway until several moments later. He remained there silently, watching his son. Something about his expression caught my attention. Relief. Real relief. The kind that only appears after carrying worry for far too long. Oliver looked up first. "Daddy." Ethan stepped into the room. The little boy immediately grabbed his father's hand and pulled him toward the rug. "Seat." Ethan actually smiled. An uncommon sight. He lowered himself onto the floor beside us. For the next 20 minutes, one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts helped build a block castle with his son. No meetings. No phone calls. No assistants. Just a father and a child. I noticed something else during those moments. Every time Ethan looked at Oliver, his face softened. Every time Oliver looked at me, he smiled. And every time Ethan noticed that smile, he became thoughtful. Later that evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep, I found myself organizing toys in the nursery. Most of the mansion had gone quiet. Only distant footsteps echoed occasionally through the hallways. I was placing books back onto a shelf when Ethan appeared at the door. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, he stepped inside. Oliver has not laughed like that in a long time. His voice was low and sincere. I smiled softly. He is a wonderful little boy. Ethan looked toward the sleeping child. He used to be happier. The sadness hidden inside those words surprised me. Before I could respond, Ethan continued. After his mother passed away, everything changed. Understanding settled over me immediately. Suddenly so many things made sense. The fear, the distance, the loneliness. Oliver was not rejecting people because he was difficult. He was protecting himself because he had already experienced loss. My heart ached for him. Ethan remained near the doorway. Most caregivers tried to manage him. You did something different. I thought carefully before answering. I did not try to make him trust me. I just stayed. The room grew quiet again. Ethan studied me for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly, as though he had finally discovered the answer to a question that had haunted him for months. As he turned to leave, he paused. Thank you, Grace. The sincerity in his voice felt heavier than the words themselves. After he disappeared into the hallway, I looked toward Oliver sleeping peacefully beneath the soft nursery light. And for the first time, I realized that Ethan was no longer simply watching how I cared for his son. He was beginning to see me. Some people carry old wounds so quietly that the world mistakes their silence for strength. I understood that better than most. A few days after my conversation with Ethan, the rhythm of life inside the mansion continued. Mornings belonged to Oliver. Afternoons disappeared into games, books, and long walks through the gardens overlooking the ocean. Evenings settled into a peaceful routine that seemed impossible compared to the stories I had heard during my first day. The little boy laughed more, slept better, smiled often. Yet the greatest change was not happening in Oliver. It was happening in the people around him. One rainy afternoon, Oliver and I sat beneath a covered terrace watching waves roll toward the rocky shoreline. He was drawing pictures with colored pencils while I helped organize his art supplies. Suddenly he looked up. Grace. Yes. He held up a drawing. 3 figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun. One tall, one small, one round. I smiled immediately. Another family portrait? Oliver nodded proudly. Then he pointed toward the smallest figure. Me. Then toward the tallest. Daddy. Finally he pointed toward the third figure. You. Something tightened gently inside my chest. Before I could respond, Ethan's voice appeared behind us. That seems to be his favorite subject lately. I turned and found him standing nearby holding a cup of coffee. Oliver grinned. Daddy. Ethan sat beside us. The 3 of us spent nearly an hour watching the storm move across the water. It felt strangely normal, comfortable, like something that had existed much longer than a few weeks. Later that evening, after Oliver fell asleep, I remained in the nursery folding blankets. The soft glow of a nightlight illuminated the room. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. I thought I was alone until Ethan appeared at the doorway. He seemed tired. Not physically, emotionally, as if carrying memories heavier than anyone realized. Could not sleep? I asked quietly. A faint smile crossed his face. Something like that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes drifted toward Oliver sleeping peacefully in bed. He looks safe with you. The honesty in his voice surprised me. I looked at the child. He is a wonderful boy. Ethan nodded slowly. His mother used to say the same thing. Silence followed. This time it felt different. More personal. More vulnerable. I hesitated before speaking. Were you close? Ethan looked toward the rain beyond the window. Very. The answer came softly. No details. No dramatic stories. Yet the sadness behind those 2 words filled the room. Without thinking, I told him something I had never planned to share. When I was 18, I practically raised my younger brother. Our parents worked constantly. For years, it was just the 2 of us figuring life out together. Ethan listened quietly. Then what happened? I smiled sadly. Life happened. My brother grew up, moved away, built his own future. I am proud of him, but sometimes I still miss being needed. The room became silent again. This time Ethan understood something about me that nobody inside the mansion knew. For several seconds, neither of us looked away. Then his gaze softened. That is why Oliver trusts you. Not because you are trying to help him. Because you understand him. The words struck deeper than he realized. As Ethan left the nursery, I glanced toward the sleeping child one last time. For weeks, everyone had been searching for the secret behind Oliver's trust. That night, I finally understood the truth myself. Sometimes the people who heal each other are simply the ones who recognize the same loneliness. The first sign that something had changed came on a Thursday night. The estate was quiet. Ocean waves rolled gently beyond the windows. Most of the staff had finished their duties hours earlier. Oliver had spent the evening building train tracks across the nursery floor before finally falling asleep. Everything seemed peaceful. Then, sometime after midnight, a soft knock sounded on my bedroom door. I opened it to find one of the night attendants standing in the hallway. Her expression carried concern. "Grace, I am sorry to wake you. Oliver is asking for you." I followed her immediately. The nursery door stood partially open. Warm light spilled into the hallway. Inside, Oliver sat upright in bed, clutching a stuffed bear against his chest. His eyes looked tired, uncertain. The moment he saw me, his shoulders relaxed. "Grace." I crossed the room and sat beside him. "Hey there. Bad dream?" He nodded. "Just once." Then he leaned against my arm. I stayed beside him quietly. No speeches. No complicated solutions. Just presence. Sometimes that was enough. Within minutes, his breathing slowed. His eyes grew heavy. Eventually, he drifted back to sleep. I carefully stood and adjusted his blanket. That was when I noticed someone standing near the doorway. Ethan. He had arrived silently enough that I never heard him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the sleeping child. Finally, Ethan stepped closer. "He asked for you before anyone else." His voice remained low. I looked down at Oliver. He was already deeply asleep. "Children know who makes them feel safe," I said. Ethan remained thoughtful. Then he surprised me. "So do adults." The words lingered in the room after he left. The following morning, life continued as normal. At least on the surface. Breakfast. Playtime. Storybooks. Walks through the gardens. Yet something felt different. Oliver seemed especially attached that day. He followed me everywhere. If I moved to another room, he appeared moments later carrying a toy or a book. Even the staff started laughing about it. The estate manager shook her head during lunch. "I think he has officially decided you belong here forever." Oliver immediately nodded. "Forever?" The confidence in his answer made everyone smile. Everyone except me. Not because I was unhappy, because part of me knew how fragile good things could be. That afternoon, rain clouds gathered above the ocean again. Oliver and I sat in the library reading picture books beside a fireplace. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood and old paper. Halfway through the story, Oliver climbed into my lap and fell asleep. It happened so naturally that I barely noticed at first. One moment he was pointing at illustrations. The next he was sleeping peacefully against my shoulder. I remained still, unwilling to disturb him. An hour later, Ethan entered the library. He stopped immediately when he saw us. Oliver slept soundly. One small hand rested against my arm. Ethan approached quietly. For a long moment, he simply looked at his son. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile he showed business associates. Not the reserved smile the staff occasionally saw. This one was genuine. Almost grateful. He lowered his voice. "He has not fallen asleep like that with anyone in years." I looked down at the child. Maybe he was just tired. Ethan shook his head softly. "No. It is more than that." His gaze shifted. Toward me. We both knew it. Oliver had made his choice. The mansion knew it. The staff knew it. Even Ethan knew it. And as rain tapped gently against the library windows overlooking the gray Atlantic, I realized something that frightened me almost as much as it warmed my heart. I was no longer helping a lonely child feel at home. Somewhere along the way, this place had started feeling like home to me too. Not every wound comes from strangers. Sometimes the deepest ones arrive wearing expensive clothes and polite smiles. The trouble began on a Saturday evening. Romano Estate was hosting a private gathering. Nothing unusual. Influential guests arrived in luxury cars. Staff moved through the mansion carrying trays of food and drinks. Soft music drifted through the grand rooms overlooking the ocean. Events like these happened often. Usually I stayed far from them. My responsibility was Oliver. That evening, however, Ethan asked if I could bring Oliver downstairs for a short while before bedtime. Several longtime family friends wanted to see him. Oliver looked excited by the idea. So shortly after sunset, we entered the main reception hall together. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room. Conversations echoed softly across polished marble floors. The atmosphere felt elegant but welcoming. At first, everything went smoothly. Oliver gritit familiar faces. A few guests complimented how much happier he seemed. Several people smiled when they saw him holding my hand. Then one conversation changed the entire evening. A woman named Victoria Ashford arrived shortly after 8 o'clock. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to admiration. Expensive jewelry sparkled beneath the lights. Her smile appeared friendly from a distance. Up close it felt different. Calculated. Observant. She greeted Ethan warmly before noticing me standing nearby with Oliver. Her eyes moved over me slowly. Too slowly. "And who is this?" Ethan answered calmly. "This is Grace Walker. She helps care for Oliver." Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Ah, I see." Something about those 3 words made me uncomfortable immediately. A few minutes later, Oliver asked for juice. I offered to take him toward the refreshment table. We had barely reached it when Victoria appeared again. She smiled pleasantly. "You must consider yourself very fortunate." I frowned slightly. Fortunate? Working here. Her gaze lingered on my uniform. Opportunities like this do not come along every day. The words sounded harmless. The tone did not. I smiled politely. "I am grateful to be here." Victoria tilted her head. "Well, everyone deserves a chance, I suppose. Especially when life has not been particularly generous." My stomach tightened. Oliver looked up at me, sensing the change immediately. Children always knew. Around us, conversation continued. Yet suddenly I felt every eye in the room. Every insecurity I thought I had left behind seemed to return at once. My weight. My background. Every rejection. Every judgment. Victoria lowered her voice slightly. "It is remarkable, really. Most estates hire people who fit a certain image. I suppose exceptions can happen." Before I could respond, another voice entered the conversation. "Yes, they can." The room became quiet. Ethan stood only a few feet away. I had no idea how long he had been listening. Victoria's smile faltered. Ethan's expression remained calm, controlled. Yet something in his eyes had changed. He stepped closer. "Grace is one of the most important people in this house." The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Silence spread outward. Ethan continued. "She has done more for Oliver in a few months than anyone else managed in years." Victoria looked stunned. Ethan's voice never rose. He never sounded angry. Somehow that made every word stronger. Character matters more than appearances. Always. Nobody spoke. Nobody challenged him. Beside me, Oliver suddenly wrapped both arms around my leg. The gesture seemed small, yet it said everything. Ethan glanced toward his son and smiled faintly. Then he looked back at the room. And for the first time since arriving at Romano Estate, I realized I was no longer standing there alone. The days following the reception felt different. Not because anyone spoke openly about what had happened. Quite the opposite. Most people pretended nothing unusual had occurred. Yet I noticed the change everywhere. Staff members greeted me with new respect. Conversations no longer stopped when I entered a room. Even the guests who occasionally visited the estate seemed careful with their words. Ethan's decision had settled something that nobody else could settle. And somehow that made everything more complicated. One evening, nearly a week later, I found myself alone in the estate library after Oliver had gone to bed. Rain drifted softly against the windows. A fire crackled inside the stone fireplace. The room glowed with warm amber light. I sat in a leather chair reading while the ocean disappeared into darkness beyond the glass. The quiet felt comforting. Then Ethan entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. I looked up in surprise. He offered one to me. Thought you might still be awake. Thank you. He settled into the chair across from mine. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt natural now. Strange how quickly that had happened. Months earlier, I would have struggled to imagine sitting comfortably beside Ethan Romano discussing ordinary things. Now it felt normal. Eventually, I broke the silence. You did not have to say what you said that night. Ethan glanced toward the fire. Yes, I did. His answer arrived immediately. I studied him carefully. Why? Ethan remained quiet for a moment. Then he looked directly at me. Because it was true. The simplicity of the answer caught me off guard. He continued. Most people spend their lives trying to impress others. You never have. You show up. You care. You stay. More people should value that. I looked down at the coffee cup in my hands. Compliments had never come easily to me. Not because I disliked them. Because I rarely believed them. Ethan seemed to notice. You still do not see yourself the way other people do. The observation landed uncomfortably close to the truth. Before I could respond, he continued. Oliver does. The room grew quiet again. I smiled faintly. Oliver thinks I am the greatest storyteller in the world. Ethan smiled. That too. His expression softened. But what he trusts most is that you never ask him to be someone else. The words lingered between us. Outside, rain continued tapping against the glass. Inside, the fire cast moving shadows across the room. For the first time, I realized Ethan was no longer simply talking about Oliver. Somehow the conversation had become personal. He leaned back slightly. Growing up, I spent most of my life being told what I needed to become. Better. Stronger. More successful. More disciplined. People rarely asked whether I was happy. I listened quietly. This was the most he had ever shared about himself. Then Ethan surprised me again. You are the first person who has made this house feel alive since my wife passed away. The honesty in his voice stole every prepared response. Not because the words were romantic. Because they were real. Deeply real. I looked toward the fire, suddenly unsure what to say. Ethan rescued me from the silence. Oliver feels it too. That is why he chose you. Chose. The word echoed inside my mind. Months ago, I arrived at Romano Estate believing I was there to help a lonely child. Somewhere along the way, that child had quietly changed all of us. As the evening grew later, Ethan eventually stood to leave. At the doorway he paused. Grace. I looked up. Thank you for staying. The words sounded simple. Yet they carried the weight of everything neither of us was ready to say aloud. And as I watched him disappear into the quiet hallway, I realized the greatest change was no longer happening inside Oliver. It was happening inside the 2 people he had brought together. Sometimes the people who change your life are not the ones you spend years searching for. Sometimes they arrive quietly and make themselves impossible to forget. Spring arrived along the Massachusetts coastline a few weeks later. The gardens surrounding Romano Estate burst with color. Ocean winds carried the scent of salt and fresh flowers through open windows. Everything felt brighter somehow. Lighter. The mansion that once seemed cold and distant now felt filled with life. Most of that life came from a small boy with endless energy and a habit of turning ordinary moments into unforgettable memories. One Saturday morning, the estate hosted a family brunch. Nothing formal. Just a gathering of relatives and close friends. Laughter echoed across the terrace overlooking the ocean. Staff moved comfortably among guests. For the first time since I had arrived, the atmosphere felt less like an estate and more like a home. Oliver spent most of the morning running between tables carrying a stuffed bear beneath one arm. Everyone smiled when he passed. His happiness had become impossible to ignore. At one point, I stepped away to help prepare dessert trays inside the kitchen. I expected to return a few minutes later. Instead, I heard my name echo across the terrace. Grace. Several conversations stopped. I looked toward the sound. Oliver stood near the center of the gathering. Dozens of eyes followed his gaze. The little boy spotted me immediately. His face lit up. Then he did something nobody expected. He pointed toward me proudly. That is my Grace. Warm laughter spread through the crowd. My cheeks immediately turned red. Oliver seemed delighted by the reaction. He hurried toward me and wrapped his arms around my waist. Then came the moment that changed everything. The little boy looked up and smiled. "Mommy." Silence followed. Complete silence. My heart stopped. Conversations vanished. Even the ocean seemed quiet. Oliver repeated it happily. "Mommy." The word carried no hesitation. No uncertainty. Just pure affection. Pure trust. My eyes immediately filled with tears. Across the terrace, Ethan stood perfectly still. For one long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Ethan slowly crossed the distance between us. Oliver remained wrapped around my waist, completely content. Ethan knelt beside his son. "Oliver," he said gently. The little boy looked up. Ethan smiled. A real smile. The kind that reached his eyes. Oliver grinned back. Then Ethan did something unexpected. He looked at me. Not with surprise. Not with embarrassment. With understanding. As though he had already accepted what the child was trying to say. Oliver loved me. Everyone knew it. More importantly, he felt loved in return. Ethan stood slowly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Words felt unnecessary. The answer had been growing inside this family for months. Oliver simply said it first. The gathering eventually continued. Conversations resumed. Laughter returned. Yet nothing felt the same. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and Oliver had fallen asleep, Ethan and I stood together on the terrace overlooking the ocean. The sunset painted the horizon gold and crimson. Waves rolled gently against the distant shoreline. Ethan rested his hands against the railing. Then he looked at me. "You changed this house." I shook my head softly. "Oliver changed all of us." Ethan smiled. Maybe that was true. For several moments, we watched the sunset together. Peace settled comfortably between us. Not because every problem had disappeared. Not because life had suddenly become perfect. Because we had finally found something worth protecting. Behind us, the mansion glowed warmly beneath the evening sky. Ahead of us, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. And somewhere between those two worlds stood a little boy who had spent months teaching grown adults the simplest lesson of all. Love is not about who looks perfect. It is not about status, appearance, or expectations. It is about who stays, who cares, who chooses you every day. Oliver chose first. The rest of us simply followed his lead.